following is a Comfortably Zoned Radio Network production.
Hello and welcome wherever you may be, whenever you may be listening. This is another edition of Ask Claire along the Comfortably Zoned Radio Network. My name's Claire Hall, and on this program I talk about many things that interest me with many interesting people. And today we are going to get a little personal because we are going to talk about the high school I attended in Portland, Oregon from 1973 to 1977, John Adams High School, and my guest, Kip Carlson. And Kip, I want you to just give us a little bit of flavor of what Adams was all about, how it got started, and maybe why its story is still interesting today, even though the school has been closed for almost 40 years.
Well, it was a brand new high school in Portland, Oregon that actually opened 50 years ago this fall, September of 1969. And the Portland Public Schools turned it over to a team of 4 doctoral candidates or recent doctoral recipients from Harvard University's Graduate School of Education. The roots of that go back to 1967 when a number of, I think it was 7 of these doctoral candidates started getting together in Longfellow Hall for lunch on the Harvard campus and talking about what they would do if they were going to run their ideal high school. At that time, the old kind of traditional high school format in a lot of cases was being seen as somewhat stale. You were having a lot of social change in the United States and around the world anyway, but the notion of 50 minutes of science, 50 minutes of English, you go in, sit, absorb material, and then are tested on it at some point, every 3 weeks, final exams for the term, just didn't seem to be connecting with students. And so these people began thinking about and talking about, well, if we could change high schools, how would we do that? Some of the people who were in that group were also involved kind of in the teacher training portion and looked at the hospital model where you had doctors in training following around skilled doctors. They were getting their training in the field, so to speak, not strictly in the classroom, and wanted to incorporate that into education so that, prospective teachers, instead of simply getting classroom coursework and then being thrust into a classroom, maybe with a little bit of student teaching, were actually getting more time in the field around students, seeing what was going on, getting more feedback from a teacher. There was also an interest in what are the best methods for instructing students, what's the research that could be done in terms of the most effective ways to reach students. And so they kind of came up with a teaching hospital model, that their ideal high school would involve not just some different ways of educating students, but also different ways of training teachers. You would have a research division where different methods of teaching could be evaluated and tried, figure out what works, what doesn't, think of other things to do. And they really wanted also a model where everyone had a say in school policy, school procedures, that it was more of a democratic institution than principal at the top, then vice principals, then down to faculty, and kind of a hierarchical structure, is that they envisioned a governance system that included input from not just the administration, but also faculty, students, parents, and finding a way to make that work. And so all of those went into a proposal that they eventually put together and sent out to a wide range of school districts across the country, colleges of education. They had widely varying responses from, this is crazy to we're interested. We think this might be something that we could support. And came down to eventually the finalists, as I recall, without having everything in front of me on a Saturday morning, were Philadelphia, Berkeley, California, and Portland, Oregon. And for various reasons, you had Philadelphia. They weren't wild about, I think they were going to be getting very lower class economically school. They weren't sure that that was something that they were really suited for. Berkeley had some other things go on to where they kind of pulled out, but Portland, not really by default. Berkeley was still kind of there for the choosing, but Portland had a very supportive superintendent, supportive school board, and came to an agreement that they would hire 4 of these people, bring them out, and make them the administrative team. They gave them a planning year of 1968-69 that they would be in the city of Portland, recruiting faculty, coming up with curriculum as the building was being finished, and then open up in the fall of 1969. And so that's kind of how it started. And I would throw in as well, one aspect that they really wanted to stress was student responsibility for their own education, that they would be making some decisions about what they studied. They wanted to break down the large comprehensive high school into smaller units so there was more connection between students and faculty. And so they divided it into 4 houses. Each student would be assigned to a house. And the houses, I should add a part about that, would be involved in what was called general education, and that would be half of each student's day, that they would be in these groups where you would have a teacher, science teacher, math teacher, English teacher, social studies teacher, and maybe a teacher from an elective subject. That would, instead of dividing classes into each of those subjects, they would take a problem. It was problem-based education or subject-based education. They would look at that certain situation or problem from the lens of science, mathematics, communication, all these different areas. Students could, to some degree, pick how they wanted to study that, what part of it they wanted to look at. That was half of your day and got you through those 4 core subjects. And then the other half of your day would be, maybe band, any of the other elective subjects you might want to take. They had a brand new state-of-the-art industrial arts education wing. And in some cases, it could be going to a resource center and studying something on your own, or as it turned out, just having free time was how a lot of students would spend part of that other half of the day. And so that's kind of a summary of what the idea was when they threw the doors open in September of 1969.
Quite a vision, quite a revolutionary vision, and as we progress with the story, we'll find out that unfortunately Adams ran into a multitude of challenges. But as I mentioned up front, that I am a graduate of John Adams High School, but you are not, and in fact, you never set foot in the place, if I'm correct. So where did your passion for researching and hopefully eventually telling the Adams story in a book, tell us about the origins of that?
It was, probably about 2008, and I had just gone from a career in journalism and had been working in the sports information office at Oregon State University for a while and was getting into a career in education. I had kind of decided that what I enjoyed most about the job I'd had was helping students with writing, and, being a high school journalism teacher might be a really interesting thing to do, and went back to school at Willamette University to get my master's in teaching. And right around that time, a friend and I were trying to remember the nicknames, I should say, of the Portland high schools that had closed in the late 70s, early 80s, and came across the John Adams webpage that, yes, it was the Patriots, which was what I had thought. I had trouble remembering the Washington Colonials, but there were some things on there that alums had written about this experimental high school, and it jogged my memory that we had a typesetter at the place in McMinnville where the Linfield College paper, which was where I went for my undergraduate work in the early 1980s, the typesetter had been a graduate of Adams and told us these stories about this, kind of offbeat, strange high school that she had gone to. And I could remember that, and we were kind of intrigued by some of what she told us. I don't remember the details of it, and sadly I haven't been able to figure out who it was.
Oh, my.
But that triggered my memory, and so since I had just started studying education for the master's degree, looked up a couple of things and came across a series of articles in the Phi Delta Kappan, an educational journal, that were written by the members of that Harvard team that had come out in, I think it was early 1970, sometime I believe during the first year of the school, and them talking about, here's what we think students should be doing to get an education, to the idea of cross-curricular education, crossing boundaries between subjects, giving them some responsibility, making it a little more active than just sitting in class. And thinking at that time, because as I was back working for that degree, I had gone to work at my old high school here in Corvallis, Crescent Valley High School, and was around students each day, high school students, freshmen, sophomores, juniors, seniors, as an instructional assistant, and thinking, wow, this really is how students ought to be educated. It makes a lot of sense. And at the same time thinking, how on earth do you think you're going to make this work with a bunch of 14 to 18-year-olds, and particularly in the late 1960s when a lot of people were rebelling against social norms anyway and kind of testing the boundaries of freedom. And so started looking into it and was really intrigued by how the whole thing came to be, and then how it progressed over the 12 years that it was open, and how they tried to make some of these really innovative ways of educating work and trying to do research, and the problems that they ran into. And, had an interest since I had grown up. I started first grade in the fall of '69, and I graduated in 1981. So my first grade through 12th grade years mirrored Adams, and I could remember the high school. I can remember driving by it in Northeast Portland a few times. So it was just one of those things that the more you looked into it, the more interesting the whole story became.
Yeah, and you have given us a good picture of the innovative nature of Adams, and really that it was a story that generated not just local or regional attention, but national attention. I remember, for instance, a spread in Newsweek magazine. So, it was looked upon as a real model of innovation. And the short story, and I don't think it's a fair story, but I think most people classify the Adams experiment now as a failure. The school closed 1981, as you mentioned, only 12 years after opening its doors, and then the building ended up being demolished in 2007 after developing problems with toxic black mold and radon. So ironically, the newest high school building in Portland ended up being literally pounded into rubble. But give us a sense maybe of some of the early challenges, and I think perhaps that the leadership of Adams had difficulty negotiating some rough seas, is the way I would put it.
Sure. And one of the things that they really wanted to prove in doing this was that this was a system that you could make work in high schools across the country. They wanted it to be a model for other schools to maybe follow. So they wanted a building with a student body that was diverse, racially, culturally, socioeconomically. So they ended up with students from Jefferson High School, which was further toward downtown Portland, the Albina area, that was largely African American. Students from Grant High School, which was just kind of south of the Adams site at 42nd and Killingsworth, was where Adams was. Grant was a ways south of that had students that ranged from people living on the poverty line to some of Portland's wealthiest east side neighborhoods, and students from Madison High School, which was further east, had only been open for about 12 years. It was one of those that opened to serve some of the, kind of the urban sprawl, the spread of population away from, I guess, what you would call Portland's inner city, largely white middle class. And so a little bit of everything. Portland was not immune from some of the racial conflicts of the 1960s. There had been some significant disturbances in 1967, that summer, and then again in the summer of 1969, just before Adams opened. And so you were throwing some very diverse groups that maybe didn't know each other that well, and what they did know of each other could have been stereotypes that didn't necessarily set you thinking positively about that other group, and threw them all into one building, and that caused some real difficulties early on. They were also hoping that they would start maybe with 2 grades or so, somewhere in the neighborhood of 600 students. Portland had some severe high school overcrowding problems. They'd already opened 4 high schools since 1956 in response to the baby boom, and Adams was seen as, another one that was needed to relieve crowding at those other 3 high schools. So they ended up, I think the planning year, they told them they would probably be getting 1,000 students, which was more than they had really kind of hoped for. And then they ended up that first year's enrollment, only freshmen, sophomores, and juniors, with about 1,300 students. And so a lot more people that they were trying to inculcate this new philosophy into than they had planned on. Part of it, too, was it was such a dramatically different way of being educated from what these students had been experiencing. They were coming from, some of the fairly rigid high schools. If you were a junior, you'd already had 2 years of that. All of them had been in mostly rigid educational settings. Regardless of what year you were, from first grade on, it was fairly structured, you would say.
Mm-hmm.
It was a structured environment for learning, and they were being given quite a bit of freedom after all these years of being told what to do, and a lot of students just had no real, sense of how to handle that. So those were some of the things. The curriculum, they were still developing as the school year went on, and so faculty were at the school, at each other's homes, day and night in these teams, trying to come up with, okay, what problems are we going to look at? What kind of activities are we going to do? That they were having to design all of this as the school was going. Dave Mesereau, who was one of the teachers there, at one point had told me it was like trying to fly a plane while you were still building it.
Yike. So the issue of students having more freedom, playing a greater role in shaping their education. During the time I was a student there, I like to think that I handled my freedom pretty well and that it was a good thing for me, but the rap I heard then and the rap I'll still hear today is most 14 to 18-year-olds simply aren't prepared to handle that kind of freedom, and I'm wondering your perspectives, Kip, looking back at your own experience in education as well as your research on Adams. What's your thought on that argument?
I think a lot of it was being handed that freedom all at once. They speculated, and some of the teachers even speculated, if you had somehow incorporated some of that freedom from the time that you're in kindergarten, from the time you're in first grade, and so that you're brought up learning how to handle that and what some of the consequences of mishandling it might be when you're younger, that you would have been able to handle that in high school. And in fact, the original Harvard team lasted for 2 years at Adams, and then the principal, Robert Schwartz, was reassigned to another position in the district. The others, I think one stayed with the district, Alan Dobbins. 2 others went to other positions in education elsewhere. But the position that Robert Schwartz was assigned to was looking at the notion of taking the Adams plan, kind of that philosophy, and using it, coming up with one of the feeder elementary schools, or one of the K through 8 schools, which was common in Portland at that time, and putting that philosophy into that school and seeing how it would work if you did bring these kids up in that philosophy. And so they were trying for a federal grant that would help them do that. The grant didn't come through, so nothing really came of that effort.
It's a shame. It's a shame. And then, I think it's interesting to consider that voters in Portland. You talked about the baby boom, the really big surge in students, and it seems like Adams and I believe Jackson opened the year before that. The building was kind of predicated on the idea that the baby boom growth was going to continue. And of course, we know that, with the benefit of hindsight, that the baby boom did taper off. So, the neighborhood simply was not producing as many high school age kids as it had at the end of the 1960s. Plus, I think, unfortunately, Adams developed, a rather checkered reputation. I mean, I remember my own eighth grade class, and it seemed like several of the girls and at least half of the boys, the girls went to Monroe High School, which was then the Girls Polytechnic High School in Portland, and boys opted for Benson. And, how much did the reputation, deserved or not, in your view, contribute to the downward enrollment spiral that finally forced the closure of Adams?
It didn't help, and Portland went to a fairly liberal transfer policy that parents who didn't want their kids, in this, pass-fail grading was another one of the things, the free time that made it easy for them to transfer out. There were sort of core clusters that different high schools had. Cleveland had the business program. I think Washington and later Washington Monroe had a medical track that students could get into. Jefferson was the arts, and so some students went away for that. They made it kind of easy to transfer out of there. There were some things where they were trying to balance out the minority populations in different high schools, and so Adams enrollment had been one of the higher minority enrollments, and they made it easier for some of those students to transfer out to try and get that number a little higher at other high schools that were more Caucasian. It was really kind of interesting because when the principal that was there during most of your years, Don Holt, came in, they really made some strides and came up with some things that put a little more structure into the learning. They were starting to figure things out. But as you said, and there were some violent incidents early on that hurt the school's reputation, and that kind of led to this dwindling enrollment. And it wasn't just at Adams. If you go back and you look at the numbers for Portland Public Schools enrollment, they actually started declining as early as, I think, 1963, 1964, right around there. And there were still two of these high schools on the drawing board to be opened. And so when that decline continued through the rest of the 1960s and into the 1970s, by 1974, Portland is already looking at, okay, we have 14 high schools open right now, and that's too many. We need to start looking at who we're going to cut. And because of Adams' reputation, it was one of them that was on the chopping block just about from the start of those discussions.
A shame. You mentioned that this fall marked the 50th anniversary of the opening of Adams, and this summer we had a Adams celebration, a Friday night dinner dance and a Saturday picnic, and you were on hand for both those events. And during your years of research on Adams, you've had a chance to get to know a lot of the faculty and students who turned out for those events. And I'm curious on your perspectives as somebody, again, who did not graduate Adams but yet has gotten to know the Adams community quite well. The sense of camaraderie, of school spirit that still remains 50 years later, even though our school doesn't exist any longer.
It's really interesting. You have a lot of the people, such as the ones who are at the reunion, that absolutely love their experience there, that have friendships that have remained, that feel loyal to the institution. There are other folks I've talked with that absolutely hated their experience there. And so I've really tried to get a balanced perspective on what everyone's experience was, or at least a slice of each group, knowing that not everyone in a group is the same.
Sure.
Yeah, it's been, and in fact, I'll throw you a story. I don't think I've told you this one yet, Claire.
Okay.
It was about a week and a half ago. I was at an Oregon State basketball game and sit kind of in the east baseline bleachers, and halftime, a gentleman who's been sitting behind me for the past few years taps me on the shoulder and goes, "What's your connection to Adams High School?" I'm like, huh? Because I think we've slapped high fives a couple of times on Beavers wins before, but hadn't really talked about that. And I said, I'm trying to do a book on it, but why do you ask? And she goes, well, my wife went to Adams, and her friend Gail Heineman, who's one of the organizers of some of these reunions, had sent her pictures from the 50th anniversary, and I saw this picture in there, and I'm going, I know that guy from somewhere. I know him. And he finally figured out it was the guy who sits in front of him at OSU games, and he goes, yeah, my wife and her brother went there. I'll tell her about it, and gave her my card. And so I'm trying to think, the last home game was last weekend, and his wife attended. And we talked a little bit, and I'd said, yeah, I'd love to sit down and talk to you about your experience at length sometime. And she goes, well, it wasn't the best 4 years of my life. I'll put it that way. And so you have this wide variance in how people looked at it. And it was kind of funny because I should add to the OSU thing, somebody that goes to the games with me a couple of times a year is Steve Anderson, who lives here in Corvallis and was a student teacher when Adams opened, came back, I think the third year it was open, and was there until it closed. Yep. And so she remembered Steve, and unfortunately Steve wasn't with me at that game, but I need to try and get the two of them together sometime. So it's been a lot of connections, a lot of people who absolutely loved their time there. I've talked to students who said they went on to college, they went on to do some great things based on not having optimal home lives or educational backgrounds coming in without the personal student-teacher connections that they were able to make at Adams. They never would have even gotten to college, that they may have struggled when they got there based on some of the academic methods at Adams, but it made a big difference in their lives. And I've had other people who were students tell me, I really feel like I got cheated. I think I could have done more in life if I'd have had the more structured background. More upper-level science classes and some of those things. I really think I could have done something, and I feel like I was cheated.
My. Some interesting lessons, and I think, very much still have application for us today. Kip,
it really does,
because
people...
Yeah.
I was going to say, people still talk about educational reform, and a lot of the things that was tried at Adams, or a lot of the things that were tried at Adams, have come back through. The whole Gates School within a School program was very similar to what Adams ended up with its schools within a school, which was what the houses evolved into, but on a little more of a track basis, that you had a house for people that wanted to go to college, a house for people who knew that they wanted to go straight into the workforce, a house for people who weren't sure. And some of the teachers that I've spoken with or administrators said that when Portland began looking at doing that, and I think they ended up with 4 high schools using that model for a while, they went in and said, we tried this. Would you like to know what we found out, what worked and what didn't? And we're just told, no, we got this. Never mind. The cross-curricular education and team teaching, that's tended to come back through. Combining English and social studies work. A lot of it was tried, a lot of it, and some good stuff that happened there, and in some ways it's just kind of been dismissed and kind of blown to the winds.
That's a shame. That is really a shame. Well, I'm glad you are preserving these stories, preserving these memories and this history.
Well, thank you. It's been a pleasure. One of these days I've got to get the thing wrapped up, done, and out there for people to read. The book consists of a lot of individual stories that go into much more detail about how their experience affected these people, both when they were in school and their lives after. I've managed to speak with the 3 remaining Harvards who opened the school, and they talk about some of the things that they didn't consider when they were planning and opening the school. They're very forthcoming. And in some cases, I think they're harder on themselves than than they need to be, simply because, well, there were a lot of things that they didn't take into consideration, and they were all very young. I think the oldest when the school opened was 31 years old. But there were a lot of things that ended up working against them, over which they had no control.
Exactly. A fascinating story, and I look forward to it, and I think many other people will as well. Kip Carlson talking with us about the story of John Adams High School. Brief but memorable life of a secondary school in Portland, Oregon. Thanks so much for taking the time to talk with me.
You're very welcome, Claire, and go Patriots.
Go Patriots. And until next time, happy trails.
The proceeding has been a Comfortably Zoned network production. You are advised to keep your dreams wet, your humor dry, your children and grandchildren out of military recruiting offices, and off the laps of clerics who wear dresses. Thank you for listening, everyone. Happy trails.